AI-Driven Development with Paul Duvall.
The Azure and DevOps podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using the latest in .NET, Azure, AI, and DevOps. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. The show is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm. Find them at www.clearmeasure.com. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. I'm excited about my guest today. His name is Paul Duvall, and he's an award-winning author, a longtime DevOps leader, and a former AWS executive with more than 2 decades of experience in software engineering. He co-founded Stelligent. He established a business dedicated to enabling enterprise customers to adopt DevOps and security practices on AWS. And then he currently runs his consulting company at redactedventures.com. He's also the author of the book that defined continuous integration for the world, called Continuous Integration, Improving Software Quality and Reducing Risk. And the book received the 2008 Jolt Award and continues to be pretty much the official textbook for continuous integration. And today he focuses on helping engineering teams adopt AI native and DevSecOps practices. And he draws on his multiple decades of experience delivering and managing software solutions. Well, Paul, I'm excited to have you on the show. Welcome, and how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Excited to be here. That's quite an intro. Appreciate that.
Well, you've done quite a bit. I mean, it's all things that you've been able to have an impact on in the industry. And I want to kind of ask you about that before I dig in. A lot of the listeners have read your book and seen your work, but some haven't, because we have so many new developers always coming into the industry pretty much every year. And so, if you were to kind of go back, quite a ways, what was it about custom software and this angle on delivering software well that just grabbed your attention and grabbed your focus when the software world is really, really so broad?
Yeah, definitely goes back a ways. So I think I was writing the book about 20 years ago now, and it took about 2.5 years to write it. But it was definitely motivated by my own experience and as a software engineer and delivering software to customers. I remember my very first project. It was a really large medical logistics project. We probably had 6 development teams, and I was kind of working across those teams. And I think in total we had 100. I mean, it was quite large. It was deployed across the world, and it took us 2 years to actually go from idea to actually having it in production. And one of the things I was involved in is the installation at one of the first logistics centers kind of nearby. And I got to see the users actually use the software that I had built, right, along with my colleagues. And it was just one of those like aha moments. It's like, because immediately they started using it. They were really excited. But then they gave me 5 or 6 ideas, in terms of how to improve it. And I just got so excited by that whole notion. I was like, I want to do that on a regular basis. I don't want to wait 2 years for this process, right?
Right.
And nowadays people are probably talking, more like 2 months or 2 weeks is too long, which I agree with. But and so that kind of motivated me, and I started getting into things like sort of what I always refer to as behind the scenes software development. And so like how do you build and test, how do you deploy it, and that sort of thing. And so I got into things like Steve McConnell wrote the book Code Complete, and he was talking about the daily build that they were doing at Microsoft. And then I started, hearing from people like Martin Fowler and Kent Beck around doing CI. And, so I started doing that on my own, in delivering my own software solutions for customers. And started writing about it and started speaking about it. And then, so I reached out to, I think it was Addison West. I reached out to a few publishers, and that kind of led to to writing the book, and it's one of those things where you don't know what you're getting into when you start it. You also don't know how much you don't know. This is a good thing about it. And so I learned a lot through the process and brought it back also into the work I was doing for customers at the time.
So I'm chomping at the bit to ask you about what you're currently working on around AI and applying it to development. But on the continuous integration front, it seems like so many teams still today, they grab a build server product and then they click, do the configuration and basically have effectively an automatically triggered build of some sort. And then they kind of dust their hands off and say, we have continuous integration.
Yes.
And so if I could just straight from you, just the high points about, okay, this is the continuous integration pattern. You got to have these things, and that's the pattern. What would you say?
Yeah. Some of this is so automatic now, but I think you have to have. I think what people, kind of mess up oftentimes is kind of what you're saying, is that they think the tool is CI, right? And it's really about the practices and the tools. So it's sometimes people say it's only about the practices. Well, the tools are, a big part of it as well. But to me, you have to, one is you have to be working on the main line. So, maybe you have, kind of very, very short-lived branches that you might be using, but you're ultimately moving that into the trunk. So really trunk-based development is one of the big things. Is that the other one is that you're committing very often, early and often. I would say, especially nowadays, in the days of, using AI-assisted development, I think that becomes even more important. The other thing is that you have your automated tests, and you're running your tests as a part of the process, and then that you're not going to be committing code that's going to break. And so you're running, say, a local build or whatever before you do your push into your version control system. And then I would say, I don't know if it's the last one, but is that you stop the line when something goes wrong. And so especially, if you're working on teams, it becomes the number one priority, is that when the build gets broken, when it's running those build and tests and so forth, that the second there's an error, that, that we stop our work and we fix that. That becomes the number one priority, is having a clean build and a working system is of utmost importance. And when I think about CI, it's hard not to include, there's sort of a separate practice of CI, but these days I practice continuous delivery, and in some cases continuous deployment, but they kind of go hand in hand as well. But in terms of CI, that's to me, those are the build, the tests, those practices around having kind of stopping work if anything goes wrong, and putting the effort into making it work again.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. Now, your brain is mostly wrapped around AI and how it's kind of morphing the process and put the focus on, hey, let's deliver custom software really well. And can we do an even better job now that we have this new technology? So what aspect of that are you thinking about?
Yeah. So I've been working with, AI assisted development since I was looking at my GitHub, kind of history, and you can kind of see it go a little bit crazy around 2023. I think February 2023, I started using ChatGPT, and I immediately went into one of my personal kind of muse projects that I've been working on since probably 2015 or so. It's like a personal finance thing that I do, and so I started doing that on the weekend. So I was working at AWS at the time, and we weren't able to do the kind of exploration I wanted to do in my kind of daily work or in my role as well. And so I was working on the weekends and using ChatGPT and things like that. And so it's kind of I've been doing a lot now. It's 3 years now, and kind of gone through the ChatGPT to the, say, Cursor to Windsurf to Claude Code to Codex and kind of everything in between, and kind of gone through that whole progress of agentic development. And so for me, the practices that we learned around, CI/CD and around, just good software engineering practice. I was talking about before about committing often and running tests and things like that. It's like that becomes even more important with AI. You always hear about the stories of people like, building something in a hour or day or whatever. And that's all well and good. But to me, I think those engineering practices are becoming even more relevant, especially when you have AI generating code for you, in cases in which maybe you're not necessarily reviewing every single line of code, but you have the processes, you have the static tools that you're running, say, static analysis tools, you're running tests, but you're also running, you can use AI to review itself, for example, and apply refactorings and things like that. And so if anything, there's some specific patterns that are coming out of that, but that are built on top of all the knowledge that we've learned in software engineering over the years. And so, I've built an open source repo called AI development patterns, and it describes right now, I think I'm around 22 patterns, kind of main patterns, and then I have a number of experimental patterns. I think it's like 15 experimental patterns, which I'll eventually move some of them. Some of them I won't. I'm just experimenting with them. And then I built some other tools off of that to augment my own. It's kind of the same reason that I wrote a book and started a company, is kind of in some ways to solve my own kind of challenges and issues. And then I just release it out to the world. Nice.
That seems like you have a calling of a teacher. You're like, this is a problem, we don't have it figured out, and you're noodling on it,
yeah.
and then you can't, and then you're just like, of course I'm going to share it. Of course I want to teach people.
Well, yeah. Awesome. My dad was a teacher for 30 years in county school, and my brother and sister are also teachers as well. So yeah, it's kind of in the blood.
Nice. And so you mentioned, okay, we're using AI. AI's generating code. I want to key off of something you mentioned, and maybe I'm not reviewing every line of code. I think there's some listeners just like, what? I'm going to let a machine put some code in my code base and I'm not even going to look at it? But then I think of, if we're actually going to get faster, isn't it logistically impossible to actually set eyes on every line of code?
Yeah. I mean, I think, it's evolving, as we're going through this process. And so I, like, just my own personal experiences, I was reviewing every line of code, and it's becoming less now, right? And I'm definitely not reviewing every line of code now, and it is about kind of like putting those practices in place such that it is, running the types of things that that you would have to remember to check yourself, and so you can ask the AI, hey, check these, these rules. And the other thing, the other way I look at it too is like, as like when I was at AWS, a leader of multiple teams, and I wasn't reviewing every single line of code, right? That people were writing. They were reviewing their code, and then we had all sorts of mechanisms in place to ensure that the code was of high quality before it ever got to customers. And so to me, it's the same kind of thing, right? Is that you're putting the mechanisms, you're putting the systems in place such that the code is reviewed, and it's reviewed multiple times, but it might not be reviewed literally by you every single time. And I think we're continuing to go up layers of abstraction. It's like people aren't looking at assembly code that gets generated from programming languages either. We're not quite there yet, but I'm just I'm just saying, like, that to me, that's the nature of the evolution here.
And I remember, I'm sure you remember implementing automated deployments for a client who'd never done automated deployments before. And similar notion, wait a minute, I'm just going to let a machine touch production? Whoa, whoa, whoa. But we've gone through that journey, and now it's normal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember when customers would say something like that, and I'm like, you're going to let a human like go through all those steps every single time? It's like, I'd rather it go through, yeah, sure, the human defines the deployment steps, but I'd rather it go through these steps the same way every single time to do something like that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like the huge divide between what is creative work and then what is repetitive and then consistent work.
Yeah. And it's the crazy thing is like it's changing so rapidly right now too. So what we thought was say creative work, and the example you gave with deployments, I would say that was considered creative work at a certain point in time, and then it became less creative and became more of a checklist kind of item. But now, gosh, over the past 3 years, it's just rapidly changing in terms of that. My personal view is that I don't think the practice of software engineering is I think it's just evolving, right? I think, and as a software engineer, you're going to have to evolve along with it. As AI increases its impact on what we do as software developers. I'm not concerned about the end of software engineering.
Yeah. You've got your blog at paulmduvall.com. We'll include a link to that in the show notes. But one of your posts that I just want to ask you about that's really interesting is spec-driven AI, combining specs and TDD for AI-powered development. Specifically TDD, I've been thinking about that is, okay, red-green refactor. And with AI coding tools, is that pattern still need to be the same, or does the process of expanding the test suite and the code at the same time, does that have to change with the technology, or does it fit exactly as we've done it by hand?
Yeah. I mean, at this point, I think a lot of us, including me, are kind of using what we did with Agile and XP and so forth, and like with TDD in particular, is like in some ways we're replicating. That's what I'm doing, is kind of replicating. I literally, like, if you look at some of the stuff I publish around centralized rules, where we're ensuring that certain rules are applied based on the context of the prompt or whatever, like it literally says like red, green, refactor, kind of go through that process. There was definitely around that time that I wrote that, there was a lot of interest, and I still see that as well. But there was a lot of interest in, where's the code now, right? Is the code in the specification, right? So, or is it in the code itself? And so, I kind of go, I don't know if I go back and forth on it, but it's a little nuanced in terms of, I'd like to think that we're kind of at a point where we're defining our specifications. So we're defining that in Markdown. We could define that in various ways. There's the ears format, there's user stories, there's PRD, however that's defined. You're describing that how you want your, ultimately how you want your application to behave, what features you want to have. And then you're defining acceptance tests against that. And that, in many ways, that becomes the thing that, as software developers, that we're working through, is we're looking through the specifications, we're looking through the acceptance tests, and then that's generating the code based on those specs. Now, there are also people, including me, that are actually writing those tests, right? Through or having AI write those tests, right? And so that's where I think we're going through again, an evolution in terms of the perspective on this, because in some cases, once you have those tests written, your acceptance tests written, you don't want it to modify that, right? And so there's people that are putting it in place, like permissions and things like that. Now you have to kind of gear or put some guardrails around the AI in terms of what you might modify and things like that. But they're trying to make sure, like, okay, I have these golden tests. Don't modify AI. Don't go and modify those, right? So I've not gone there yet, but I appreciate the perspective on that, where people are coming from there.
Well, yeah, and that's difficult because you change some implementation that may be where the, I don't know, names, like if you have a name enumeration or some little tag that there literally does need to be a change, otherwise there's going to be a compile failure. So there is going to be a commit that modifies that file from a literal perspective, but it's a benign modification.
Yeah.
Right,
and there's a number of tools that are kind of really embracing that spec-driven model. So Kiro is one of AWS. Kiro is one of them, where they're using Kiro.
Okay.
And I've used that a little bit. The switching cost between these AI tools is really small. Like, I can literally go same code base, work in Claude Code, jump over to Codex, no issue, jump over to Kiro. What Kiro provides, though, is a very spec-driven kind of engineering kind of focus, where it helps you define the specifications, then it creates the design, then it creates the implementation. You can kind of see how it works all along the way. It's a little bit behind in terms of some of the capabilities, and that's why I don't tend to use it so much. But they're one of them. Tessel, TESSL, they're another company that has a framework and tooling around this, around spec-driven development. And so there's some people that are kind of thinking hard about this.
Well, that seems to be a really important part of the process. If I look at Claude and Cursor and Copilot, and they're focused on modifying the code, multi-file edits and running commands, and of course it can run shell scripts to run private builds and all that. But even before that, if you just give a little snippet like change this screen and it's just one sentence, and that's literally all the definition you get, it's pretty random. And so with the concept of shifting left, if you don't fully describe what the intent is, well, you could give it to a developer on the team and they could be just as confused and have random results. So exactly. I'm wondering if it makes sense to have some of these tools that do have a focus on developing the full idea, the full specification and decisions around it, and that be separate from the tools that actually do code modifications.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that there's definitely a lot of work in this area, and one of the things, and I'll sometimes do this, is you'll write it in, you'll have it generate in Claude Code, then go over to Codex and say check the work. Basically, you can have it check itself too, but there's always you always get sort of a different perspective by doing that. There's definitely a lot going on in the spec-driven space, and but I agree. Like you'll hear these stories as well. You'll hear the AI, and I've had my many frustrations of saying, no, literally it's right there. How can you not see this? And but it's definitely gotten better. That's for sure. But in the end, it does come down to how specific you are in your intent. You can also ask it. One of the patterns that I use, I don't know if I've actually documented this as a pattern, but I'll ask it. So I'll put a prompt in, or I'll ask it to do something, and then it'll give me a response, and I'll say, so next time I ask this, how could I improve this prompt so that I get a better result, right? And sometimes I'll go over to another LLM to do that as well. And it's amazing, like what it does. I was just doing that this morning. It's like I wrote two sentences, and before I actually prompted Codex in this case, I think I went to Claude and I said, here's what I want to send to Codex. What do you think? And it sends me, and you could see the detail in what it was thinking. It was like, you were vague in these areas. And so then I put it in and got a just amazing result.
Sounds like maybe you mentioned reviews. It almost, perhaps it makes sense to have an automated spec review before it goes to an AI coding tool. Because that question about which things here seem to be vague. Let's fill those gaps.
Yeah, I have, so you can create, for example, in Claude, and I think Codex as well. I know Claude probably the best at this point, but you can create these custom / commands. So they have built-in commands. I think they have like code review command, a security command, things like that. But you can basically do your definition of done, right? You can write a command. It's just markdown, just saying to check things like you're talking about. You can also write hooks. And so I describe this as the event automation kind of pattern because a number of them have this kind of capability, but based on an event. So for example, before you commit your code, run through these checks. It's almost like running a local build or something like that. But in this case, you can have it run those static types of checks, build, test, static analysis, whatever. But then you can also have it run, kind of AI generated, like look for things I didn't think about, basically, like look for refactorings or whatever. But whatever your definition of done is, you can build that into the automation of the tool itself, such that it kind of prevents you from committing bad, or prevents the AI from committing bad code.
Well, with all your work in putting that experience towards this problem, as you think about it, what do you tend to optimize for? Do you tend to optimize a scenario where a software engineer is monitoring and personally running all of these tools, throughout the day, or are you optimizing for any scenarios where you specify something and send it in and go to lunch and fire and forget and come back later?
Yeah. I do tend to optimize. What I think about is almost like an AI software development lifecycle. So, when I was running Stelligent, for example, we were kind of optimizing for the commit to production lifecycle. And so this probably expands beyond that. It shifts further left into the product lifecycle, specifications, things like that. And so I'm thinking about, it's what I thought about, that story I was talking about at the beginning, like how long it was taking. I'm just someone that I think about the whole supply chain, the whole process. I think about it like a manufacturing process from idea to production, and how do you optimize that? And so all these patterns and things that I end up writing about are either from what I'm seeing out in the industry, customers I'm working with, and my own experiences.
Okay. Yeah, commit to production. That's kind of roped up in the DevOps umbrella, and now adding in further up into the requirements, into the specification. So, have you put your brain towards all of the logging and telemetry now that's like running in production, or has that not kind of been an area of study so far?
No, like around observability and things like that, for sure. There's definitely that, especially when you get into things like continuous deployment, there's that idea that, you really want to get that information that's running in production and then bring it back. To me, it's always about shortening those feedback loops as much as you possibly can. So if you're running that kind of instrumentation in production, your goal, I think, is to get that telemetry, that information, get it right back into the development lifecycle as quickly as you possibly can. And so, I've got some kind of patterns that I apply in terms of running tests in production, for example, tests and telemetry, overall observability, and then getting that back into version control and into the development lifecycle as fast as possible.
It seems like there's some of the AI tooling that's ripe for that space, about just periodically going through the logs, and because from time to time there's something that clearly means that something failed.
Yeah,
we might be good to look into that.
That's a great point, because it's not just the way it was before, where it's more static, right? You're just you're looking for certain things. You're assuming what it should find. In this case, you can maybe let the AI be a little more expansive. So that's a great point. It's the same way I look at the development life, or the when you're building, you're looking for if you can use the AI to say generate certain tests that you weren't thinking about, edge cases, that sort of thing. Same goes for production. It's like, look at all this. Is there a pattern that you're seeing such that we could then almost find the problem before it becomes an issue for the end customer, for the users?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, for someone who's using multiple AI tools in a serious way, and you're also helping clients use it, for the companies and who haven't really adopted it yet, realistic with the number of tokens and requests, what is it realistically going to cost per developer to fully equip them with the relevant capacity of these tools from a dollar perspective? We hear the $20 a month pro account, but that's like way too low so what have you found, and what's a good expectation setting?
Yeah. I just think, so I probably personally spend, now if people end up deciding to use one or the other, so I'm using Claude Code, Codex, both at the sort of the top levels. Like, I don't use the API where you can extend beyond it, right? So where you can just be charged based on tokens. But like Codex is 200, Claude Code is 200, and those are at the max levels. Yeah. And I've not had much degradation. Sometimes Claude Code in either one of those. And then I would say you could, if you pick one of those tools in your business, you could, I would say realistically, as long as you're using it to its capacity, then probably $200 a month is probably something you can expect. I'm spending more on it personally, but it's in part it's because I'm doing all this experimentation around it. Yeah.
Well, that's helpful to a lot of people.
I think that's going to change. I mean, at some point it's going to consolidate. That might be a few years in the future, and because I think some of those, I think they're losing money on some of that. So we'll see.
Yeah. Well, before we get to the end, you started another company, currently Redacted Ventures. So I wanted to ask you about that and what type of people you help, because some of the listeners out there probably fit in that category.
Yeah. So I went through the whole founding a company. When the book came out, 2007. So that was Stelligent, and ended up selling that. We built that to, I think by the time I left, we were 75 people or so. But sold that in 2017, and then joined AWS in 2021 after staying on with some of the transition. And then, so I decided I wanted to really spend a lot more time in AI. And so what Redacted Ventures is, I'm actually running a couple businesses through it, but and kind of doing some experimentation on some things. So wrote a SaaS app as well. But I would say the bulk of the work that we're doing is around helping enterprises, usually small to medium kind of enterprises that need to or want to adopt AI into their engineering workflows, and use tools like Codex and Cloud Code and so forth. but more importantly, it's like, how do you do that well? How do you adopt some of these practices and patterns that I talked about, and how do you then scale that such that you're really using AI to transform your business? You're able to do things much faster, but you want to be able to do them better as well. And and I'm taking what it was like in the early days of the cloud, because I started using AWS in 2008, 2009 timeframe. That was kind of really early on. And so when you had 3 years of experience, it was a ton. It was a lot of experience at that point. So that's kind of where I am now, because I've been kind of living, breathing AI for development for 3 years now. So, and I found, just like we were talking about, sort of that teaching. I think we were talking about beforehand, but we were talking about that sort of that teaching mentality and trying to help others apply these practices themselves.
Yeah, awesome. So companies can contact you for some consulting on that.
Yeah, and we're going to be putting out also, excuse me, guides and things like that, so that people can self-service this as well.
Awesome. We'll include a link to that in the show notes. Redactedventures.com. That's exciting. Man, I'm really pumped that you're continuing to apply your experience to the current problems, figure out patterns, and then share with the industry what you're figuring out, because the whole industry is wrestling with all these same things. The pundits, of course, people investing in AI are saying AI is just going to do everything, hand wave.
Yeah.
Well, the question is, okay, I get it. It's a new technology. We can automate some more things. How does it work? We're all like just moving through that.
Yeah, I've never had more fun, in development than I am now. So it's a great time. But yeah, you're realizing it's like everyone is figuring this out along the way. So it's fun.
Fantastic. And just closing out, I've told people the same thing. Young people interested in programming thing. Am I going to have a career if I, finish my university degree in computer science? Because of what I'm hearing, and I tell them, yes, good programmers are always going to have plenty of work. What say you?
Yeah. Well, 100%. I mean, yeah, it's hard, obviously hard to predict the future. And I will say, though, over a 30-year career, I've been hearing something like this. Yes, it's definitely different now. This is a different phase in the abstraction, how we're abstracting this away. But I said this at the beginning, and I agree that it's just going to change, and we have to change with it. In some ways, like how people had to change with the cloud as well, especially on the operations side of things. So I just see it as an evolution. I see it as a huge transformative technology, but I lean towards that this is a normal technology. It's going to have, it's going to be like electricity. It's going to be like the internet. It's going to be big, but I don't buy into some of that hype. And so I would say, yeah, stay in school and focus on and learning all this stuff and kind of growing with it.
Yeah. I'm excited for the software boom, the explosion of custom software, given that now, custom software has always been getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, but companies don't have to spend millions upon millions of dollars to get any kind of software system. It's I think it's going to shrink at a more rapid pace than it has been.
Yeah, there was a thing that at Amazon, people always talk about, right? And the two pizza team.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's going to become the two slice team. Yeah.
You probably remember Fred Brooks's book, the anthology book, the Mythical Man Month. That collection of essays. One of the essays is the surgical team, and he was positing that his favorite team is two surgeons with their hands in the patients, and then some assistant nurses around just making sure that they can focus 100% on the patient. I'm thinking, okay, well, you got two engineers, one that's the lead, one that's fully capable, two people's hands in the code, and then maybe an analyst and man, with the tool, I could see how that could be hugely productive.
Yeah. I was running a hackathon a couple months ago, and one of the team that it was two-person teams. It was a bunch of two-person teams, and the team that won this hackathon was a more of a kind of a sales lead, product focused kind of sales lead, and then more your typical software engineer. And they were paired up, and it was just like this amazing team of this is what the customer's looking for kind of perspective, and then this is how we do it with AI. And you could kind of just see them coming at it from different angles, and it was really amazing. But I see the same. I see smaller teams, and to your point before, much more software, right?
Yeah, software boom.
Yeah,
awesome,
100%.
Awesome. Well, Paul, thank you so much for coming on the show and having this conversation with me. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeffrey. It was a pleasure.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure indeed. And until next time, dear listener, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure and DevOps podcast. You can find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Visit our sponsor, ClearMeasure, at www.clearmeasure.com. And on behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.